gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Yadvinder Malhi, who's a professor of ecosystem sciences at Oxford University, and he's currently the director of the Leverhulme Center for Nature Recovery. He's been interested in the functioning of ecosystems for a long time and how this varies with geography, disturbance, and with recovery of these ecosystems. As you'll find out tonight, he has a particular passion for tropical rainforests and has been conducting research in the forests of Amazonia, Africa, Asia, and oceanic islands. And rather tragically, he told us just before we started that he'd had to go in the field to some oceanic islands in the Indian archipelago. I'm so sad he had to do that. I really am very, very jealous. He's president of the British Ecological Society, a fellow of the Royal Society. He's a trustee of the place where I work, the Natural History Museum. I can also say that he's a very good field companion because he's a person who notices things that even botanists pass by. He'll talk to us tonight about how tropical rainforests get their productivity, and also how the flows of energy in these fascinating ecosystems flow through to the animal world, and what that means for how we think about the recovery of these systems, which are so under threat. So Yadvinder, over to you. I'm really interested to hear what you have to say tonight. Thank you so much for coming along. Okay.
Thank you very much, and thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here and to talk to this audience around the world by being online. So as Sandy described, I am an ecosystem ecologist, and I'm interested in all aspects of the natural world. But I guess what my focus has been on is the connections, the flows that make up an ecosystem, the flows of energy, of nutrients, and other aspects that collectively make combinations of organisms of different species into an ecosystem and the functions of the ecosystem. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. There's some aspects of the webs of connection in tropical forests in particular that help shape the overall functioning of the forests, but also determine how these forests respond, vary in space, and how they respond to change over time. And so all forests can be seen as a cascade of energy. So ultimately, light is captured by leaves to generate carbohydrates and sugars, and they power the vegetation of an ecosystem. And then some of that energy ends up going into herbivores and ultimately into carnivores. And other parts of the energy go into dead material, into the soil, and is decomposed by fungi and bacteria, and goes and is released at that stage. And so, any ecosystem can be seen as this cascade of energy from sunlight, this captured sunshine working its way through an ecosystem. So what I'm going to do in this talk today is look at two aspects of this. Firstly, look at how we try and quantify how much energy is being captured by any particular ecosystem, and in my case, around the forest, and how it's spread through the different components of the vegetation in the ecosystem. And then for the second half of the talk, I'm going to look at how it goes beyond the vegetation into particularly mammals and birds in my case, but in other components of the system as well. And then what that tells us about the ecological functioning of a system, and how it questions perhaps some of the concepts we have around ecosystems. So to start this off, this is a picture of one of my students measuring the capture of sunshine. So she's putting a chamber on a leaf and measuring the rate at which carbon dioxide in that chamber is drawn down over a minute. And the rate at which that CO2 goes down gives you the rate of photosynthesis of that leaf. So if it's photosynthesizing a lot, the CO2 will draw down quickly. If not so much, the photosynthesis will be the CO2 will be very flat. And so from that level, we could get some estimate of the photosynthesis of a particular leaf. And you could do multiple leaves, maybe some in the sun, maybe some in the shade, and that would give us an idea of the photosynthesis of that individual tree. We have other techniques we use, micrometeorological techniques, where we can measure the photosynthesis, the respiration of an entire stand of trees, of a patch of an ecosystem. And these approaches are often called micrometeorological approaches. And what they do is measure the turbulent flow, second by second, of air coming in and out of the forest, between the forest and the atmosphere. And by measuring the speed of that air and the concentration of carbon dioxide in that air, we can see minute by minute how much carbon dioxide is going into the forest, how much carbon dioxide is going out. And we end up capturing the breath of that forest between day and night, between summer and winter, and ultimately over the years. And often when we're talking about photosynthesis, we're talking in terms of carbon, but also we can talk as much in terms of energy. And this is the high school version of the equation of photosynthesis that shows that those two are interchangeable currencies, that carbon dioxide and water are combined with captured sunshine, with its energy to form carbohydrates and release oxygen. And there's a fairly standard conversion, around 40 kilojoules of energy are captured in the process of capturing 1 gram or making 1 gram of carbon. And so you can talk in terms of carbon units, or you can talk in terms of the captured sunshine, the energy in the system. And we can do this for different sites. These are some data that we have from 2 contrasting sites. Well, in Borneo, old growth and logged forests. Just look at the old growth column for now, row for now, and also a UK forest, which is just Whiteham Woods, a forest just outside of Oxford, where I do a lot of work. And these numbers just give you an idea of some of the differences that we see. If you look at the total amount of energy falling on the forest, the total solar radiation in the left-hand column, this is in megajoules per meter squared per year of energy. You see that the forest in the tropics has about twice as much energy falling there as the forest in the UK. And any of you, well, we're just coming out now of the winter here in the UK, but any of you here in January will not be surprised by that. In winter, the low sun angles, the short days mean there's much less sunshine falling in the UK than in the tropics. And here we can quantify that. It's about half as much energy available. The next column is a measurement of how much the total amount of photosynthesis is in that forest. And you can see it's about twice as high in Borneo as it is in the UK. But when you convert it to a percentage of the sunshine falling on the forest, you see that the numbers are about the same. It's around just over 2% of the sunshine falling on the forest is photosynthesis, whether it's a tropical rainforest or whether it's a British broadleaf woodland. If you go to coniferous forests, they tend to be a bit less, but broadly these patterns are there. So tropical forests aren't any better at capturing sunshine, really. They're just they have more sunshine available that they can capture. And if you look at the next column is the fraction of that sunshine that is used to produce biomass, whether it's wood or leaves or roots. So this is called the net primary productivity. And the right-hand column says what fraction of that photosynthesis ends up as biomass. So you see that typically for a forest is around 40%. So of all the photosynthesis going into a forest, around 40% ends up as leaves or wood or roots. And the rest of that photosynthesis goes for the metabolism of those plants themselves, and ends up the energy the plants need to grow to maintain themselves, and so that's burnt up by the plants themselves in their own metabolism. And that gives you a measurement at the scale of an individual stand of or ecosystem, and then we could scale up to a much larger level by using satellites, by looking at the greenness or the multispectral qualities of a particular pixel of the Earth's surface, and then by having these close-up measurements, calibrating those data and being able to scale up to the scale of the whole planet. And we end up with maps like this. This shows you the gross terrestrial productivity, the total photosynthesis of the Earth's land surface. And we see patterns that we broadly understand. The highest values are in tropical regions, in red there. And then the lowest values are in deserts, such as the Sahara, and other areas in blues and greens are in between. And we understand what's going on here. The wet tropics have the highest productivity because they have a year-long growing season. It's warm and wet the entire year. Trees, plants can grow, and we have high productivity. Once you get to higher latitudes, it's not the lower temperatures per se that restrain productivity, but it's the dormant season, the presence of winter, where plants can't photosynthesize. That determines because they have no leaves, that determines the productivity. And once you go to deserts and dry areas, it's the dry season where plants can't photosynthesize, that lowers productivity. So we have a pretty good understanding of the global pattern of productivity. One of the advantages of being in a geography department is that I'm surrounded by people that think a lot around maps. And a few years ago, I sat with a colleague of mine, Ben Henning, who's now in Reykjavik, and we thought about using a different approach to show the same data that I showed in the previous map. And so here, instead of just using color to indicate productivity, we use the size of the pixel to indicate productivity. And so areas that are more productive end up fattening out, areas that have low production end up squeezing away into almost nothing. And this is called a cartogram. And when we do this in the form of a cartogram, we get this sort of pattern with the bulging equatorial regions, the squashed out deserts. And we can do this at different times of the year. If we do this in January, when the Northern Hemisphere is essentially biologically shut down, we see that in January, we truly live on a tropical planet, that most of the biological activity that's happening on the land surface is happening in the tropics. Biologically, Brazil is the largest country on Earth. The Congo, Indonesia are not far behind. So biologically, these are the center of the energetics of life on Earth, and that cascades down into them also being the centers of biodiversity and the richness of the variety of life on Earth. If we do this in July, we see something that looks a little bit more familiar. There's been the great greening of the Northern Hemisphere, and so there's a huge amount of productivity in high latitudes, enhanced by the long days, the long sunshine that's available there in the middle of the summer. And we get this sort of pattern. And we can animate this month by month, calculate this every month, and we get this pattern, which shows this relative variation in productivity on the land surface as we go throughout the year, and ends up showing this great green heartbeat of the biosphere, this pulsing of life between northern hemisphere summer and winter, that is the pulse of energy through the terrestrial ecosystem that ends up powering all life on Earth. And a similar pattern happens of course, in the oceans. There's just under half of global productivity is in the ocean system. I won't describe it here because we can't put it into the same sort of neat cartogram as we can on land. But between terrestrial photosynthesis and marine photosynthesis, we end up shaping the nature and energy of life on land. So that shows you what we can do by having a few point measurements and then using satellite data to try and extrapolate from the greenness to larger areas. But we do face a challenge in the tropics. We don't have many of these high-tech measurements that can measure the breadth of the forest in detail. We don't have in many places they're too remote, they're too challenging to be able to do these high technology automated measurements over time that are needed as reference points for the satellites. So what I'm going to describe next is something that we've been working on for the last 10, 15 years as a different approach to try and understand the productivity of tropical forests and to then validate these satellite maps to say, how accurate are they? Or are there nuances and differences in these patterns that aren't captured simply by looking at greenness from space? And this brings in the ecology. And as I said, I describe myself as an ecosystem ecologist. And what ecosystems ecology is about is this integrated study of the living and the non-living components of ecosystems and their interactions. So it studies the flow of energy and materials through organisms and through the surrounding physical environment. And when we think about an ecosystem such as a forest, I want to just familiarize you with some of the terms that we think of here. Firstly, there is photosynthesis that I've already described, the capture of sunshine that brings carbohydrate energy into the whole ecosystem. Much of that energy is used in the metabolism or the respiration of the plants themselves, typically about 60% of that energy, and this is termed plant respiration. The rest is used to make biomass. This is the net primary productivity, and it can be in wood or in leaves or in roots. Eventually, all of that biomass ends up as dead material, most of it through either litter fall, when the leaves or roots are shed, or ultimately when the plants die and you have dead material on the ground. And that is largely broken up by soil fauna, but in particular by fungi and bacteria that break down that material and release the energy and release that carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. And that is the dominant part of the flow of carbon in an ecosystem, the flow of energy. So as a first approximation, energy flow in an ecosystem is plants making food for fungi. And everything else is just a perturbation on that fundamental energy flow in an ecosystem. But of course, that perturbation is what drives much of what's interesting and variable in the rest of ecosystems. So a fraction of that material ends up as detritivory or as herbivory, and a fraction of that goes into higher trophic levels to supporting carnivory or insectivory. And those components there, even though energetically a small part of the flow of energy in a system, are what makes ecosystems in many cases so complex and rich and shapes those systems. And so that describes the level of understanding at the level of a particular ecosystem, and where the science of ecosystem ecology can help us shape and understand the flows of energy in an ecosystem. And the other part of science where this is highly relevant is when we scale that ecosystem level understanding to the level of the entire planet. And this is a field of science, or contributes to a field of science called Earth system science, where we're trying to understand the functioning of the Earth as a whole. And as ecologists, particularly trying to understand how ecosystems contribute to the functioning of the Earth as a whole. Now, 50 years ago, we didn't have this integrated understanding of Earth system science, and ecosystems are often thought of as this passive layer at the bottom of the atmosphere, which received what environmental conditions the atmosphere gave in terms of climate and sunshine, and responded to that. And but over the last half century, there's been a great overturning of that perception with writings of people like James Lovelock and the Gaia hypothesis, but also from observations, from satellites, from simulations, from computers. And there's an increased understanding that life shapes the broader Earth environment and is an integral part of the Earth environment. So the productivity of the great forest regions, of the oceans, etc., end up shaping the atmosphere, whether on the timescales of decades or on the timescale of millions of years, and shaping the living world that we live in. So we have an interest in understanding what role life plays in shaping the Earth. And also in the context of a rapidly changing planet now, we have an interest in understanding how changing patterns of life on Earth or changing properties of ecosystems are affecting things such as the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the degree of global warming. So this linkage between ecosystem ecology and Earth system science is something that's incredibly important. And it's also incredibly fruitful because both topics talk in the same language in terms of flows of energy, of carbon, of water, are a natural interface between Earth system science and ecology. And so what we've been doing in the tropics is we're establishing a global network of intensive study sites, particularly focused on the tropics, that we've called the Global Ecosystems Monitoring Network. And this has particularly started off in South America about 15 years ago. In the last 10 years, we've also been enhancing work, particularly in Africa and in Southeast Asia as well. And we have a few temperate foci as well, the temperate forests of South America, you can see there, and also the little triangle in the UK is our own local Whiten Woods in Oxfordshire, but it's predominantly a tropical network. Just trying to get the next slide. Oops, something's happened. So what we try and do in our networks is measure many of the components of how energy is used in vegetation in a system. So we measure tree growth using dendrometers. We have litter traps that collect leaf litter every month or every 2 weeks to see how much is being produced and then shed in the canopy. And we separate that into leaves, into flowers, into fruits. We have ingrowth cores that are mesh bags that we put in the soil and then come back 3 months later and see how many roots have grown into that soil, into that root-free soil to measure root productivity. We do have screens in the ground that also try and where we try and draw and describe root productivity. And then we have little chambers that measure that we clamp on the ground and measure the rate of CO2 that's being released from the leaf litter or the soil as organisms break down organic material. We do similar measurements on the trunks of trees to measure the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the trees. And as I showed in an early slide, we directly try and measure the photosynthesis of the leaves in the from the canopy of trees. And we also measure the climate in terms of weather variables, so we can understand how the carbon varies in relation to climatic and weather variation. And we end up with diagrams such as this. This happens to be for one forest in Tambopata in southeastern Peru, in the southwestern Amazon, that shows you, I won't go into the details here, but you can see the types of detailed description of the carbon flow or the energy flow that we can come up with a system. And now we have similar diagrams for around 50 or 60 tropical forests around the world under different conditions. But one thing I will highlight here is that this term here, the ACW, is in the middle, is the woody production, the fraction, the total amount of wood biomass production per year. This is often the most visible part of a forest, but really compared to the total photosynthesis at the top, it's less than 10%. So only 10% of the photosynthesis ends up in producing the woody biomass of a forest. About twice as much ends up producing the leaves, about twice as much ends up producing the fine roots in a forest. So often the more invisible part of the forest, such as the fine roots, are often a more significant part of the energy flow than the visible parts, like as the trunks of the magnificent trees. And just a few pictures of places that we do this sort of work. This is in Peru. This is one of the earliest projects we did was looking at the slopes of the Andes. So this is a view standing at about 3,000 meters up, high up in the Andes, looking down the eastern flank of the Andes to the Amazon rainforest. And what we did there is roughly every 250 meters or so in elevation, we set up one of these intensive study plots going all the way down the slope of this valley into the lowland Amazon. And we use this as essentially a vertical laboratory where we try to understand how temperature controlled all of these ecosystem functions and to give us insights into how global warming might affect these functions in the future. There's another site that we worked a lot is in Borneo in Southeast Asia, and I'll return to some of those. And we've also had a strong focus in Africa, which has been particularly neglected in terms of ecosystem science in forests. And here some colleagues are measuring the root productivity using these mesh bags. And then we've had a number of capacity building is a huge part of this work. And when we started this work, as I said, there'd been no measurements in Africa. This is the moment where we had a workshop in Lopé in Gabon, and we produced in the middle, those 6 columns in the middle are the first data where we calculated these numbers for an African forest. The left is Amazonia, the right is Southeast Asia. And our Ghanaian colleagues followed, wouldn't want to be left behind. So a few months later, we did the same in Ghana. And now you see that the African data set ended up being much bigger than the South American or Asian data sets. And we've continued since then and have a much larger data set, but working with local partners, both in the field collection, but also in the data analysis and publication is a core part of the philosophy behind this network. And so we end up using this network to inform these satellite-based products such as this. And what we found broadly is the satellites broadly capture the patterns. That is not surprising, but there's lots of surprises there as well. For example, we find the highest productivity anywhere that we measure in the world happens to be in West Africa, in the forests of Ghana and the surrounding areas. And we're still trying to puzzle through what's going on there. Why is it these West African forests are so productive? And one of the hypotheses we have is that it's linked to this huge desert to the north that's depositing phosphorus and calcium and fertilizer every year in large amounts onto these forests and creating particularly productive forests. But this is something that we're exploring further at the moment. So what I've described here is how we quantify the total productivity, the total input of energy into a forest. And what we can think about, describe this as, this describes the peaks of energy as you go from forest to forest. What's the total amount of energy entering that ecosystem? And what we want to explore next is what happens to the energy once it enters the system. How does it cascade through that system, through the vegetation first that I've just described, the different components, but ultimately into the other trophic levels of an ecosystem, the fungi, the animals, the other components. So what is this cascade of energy, and what can we describe and understand about that? And this has quite a long history in ecology. The founding father, I think, of ecosystem ecology, the energetics of ecosystem ecology, was Ray Lindman in the 1940s, who came up with this approach. He died tragically young just after finishing his first papers on this work, but his work has been hugely influential in considering the importance of energy as a concept in ecology. And many of you will be familiar from your education of this idea of pyramids and food webs, where the primary producers, the plants, capture this energy. A fraction of that goes into the primary consumers that are eating the plants, around 10% of that energy. Around 10% of the energy in those primary producers ends up in secondary consumers, and a further 10% of that energy goes into the tertiary consumers. So this is roughly known as the 10% rule. There's variation from side to side, but broadly you have this tightening pyramid of less and less energy going to higher trophic levels. But this is a very crude rule, so we're very interested in understanding the details of this 10% rule. So what would be interesting is to know how much energy goes into all of the animals of an ecosystem and those various components. But that's a daunting challenge. But to simplify that challenge, I'm going to focus in this talk on perhaps some of the more practical components of many ecosystems, which is how much energy goes into mammals and birds. And they're often much better monitored than, say, the insects. And so we have much better idea of their abundances. We have much better idea of their behaviors. And so it's often a first entry point into trying to understand energy flow in ecosystems. So what I'm going to ask next is, what fraction of the energy that I've described that captured sunshine ends up, for example, in this deer? And how can we quantify that? And an ideal system, we'd quantify that by observing every animal and observing how long it spends eating, what it's eating, and then quantify it directly. That's almost impossible in any real ecosystem. So the approach we tend to use in a real ecosystem is use the relationships between body weight and the energetic requirements of an animal. And for any one type of animal, such as a mammal, there are broad ecological laws that seem to describe this relationship quite well. So the larger an animal, the more energy it needs, but on a this is on logarithmic axis, the relationship isn't simply one-to-one. A kilogram of elephant requires less energy than a kilogram of a mouse, for example. So the metabolism of energies per unit mass slows down the larger an animal is. But we have a broad understanding of the overall relationship between energy requirements and body weight. And we can use this if we know how many animals of a particular species there are, what the mass typically of that species is, and what those animals consume. We can come up with an estimate of what the animal population is consuming in terms of energy. So as an example, if we have a badger of mass 10 kilograms, we can calculate from its mass, we can estimate its daily energy expenditure is 5,000 kilojoules per day. If we have some idea of what the badger eats, and so, for example, locally in Whiteham, we have a pretty good idea how their diet is broken up. We can look up what the energy content of those different foodstuffs are and come up with the total food intake in the weight of food or in energy of food coming from each of those sources averaged out over the year. So that tells us what an individual badger requires over a year. And if we then have an estimate of the population, how many badgers there are per hectare or per square kilometer, also we need a little bit of behavioral data, how much food may be not coming from that forest. Maybe the badger goes out into a field. So we need some idea of behavior. And then also we need to have ideas of how long are they active in that ecosystem. Maybe they hibernate for a few months, or maybe they're migratory species that come in for some time of the year. So we have to allow for that. But ultimately, we can come up with what the population of badgers in that forest are consuming in terms of energy per meter squared per year. And then we could do that for all the other species if we have abundance data and diet data, and come up with an idea of how much energy is going into all the mammals in that forest at any one time. And so we've done this for a few ecosystems. It's not easy to do because we need rich data. We need systems where all the animals in a particular population, say all the mammals or all the birds, their abundances have been quantified. And there are very few ecosystems, especially in the tropics, where that sort of data exists. So what I'm going to show for the last 10 minutes of my talk is one particular case study that we're focusing on at the moment, which is the rainforests of Borneo. And we're looking at the intact forests of Borneo, but also the heavily logged forests. So much of Borneo has been heavily logged over the last few decades. A lot of the commercial timber species have been reduced hugely. Lots of carbon has been lost. Lots of valuable ecosystem services are certainly affected by this. And these logged forests are often called degraded forests. And one of the points I want to discuss is to question this concept of degradation. And degradation is often based on the biomass of these forests, that they've lost biomass, they've lost ecological function, and therefore it can be valuable as a concept if degradation encourages restoration. So if we're saying these are degraded ecosystems that we need to try and restore, but there can also be a dangerous term because many governments or corporates can look at a degraded system and say, well, we're not going to deforest anymore, we're not going to touch intact forests. All of our further agricultural development is going to be on degraded forests or degraded ecosystems only. So degradation can also be dangerous as a concept that allows further loss of ecosystems. And what I'm going to focus on now is whether this energy approach to thinking about ecosystems changes our view of what exactly degradation means. And so in terms of structure, there's no doubt that these forests are degraded. These are data from airborne LiDAR lasers fired down on these forests from above that give us an idea of the structure of the forest. And on the left, you see these magnificent old growth forests of Borneo, the tallest tropical forest on Earth, 60 meters tall as a mean canopy height. An Amazonian forest will be about half that height typically. So these are truly magnificent old growth forests with huge carbon stocks and cathedral-like architecture. These on the right, we have these heavily logged forests. You see a lot of that height has been lost, a lot of the structure has been lost, but they're still covered in lots of green material. And there's a dense understory, much denser than perhaps than in the old growth forests. So what I want to understand is the ecological energetics of these contrasting forests. And so what is the ecological function in these logged forests? If we look at productivity, some of the data that I showed in the first half of my talk, we see that the productivity does not decline. So the total biomass production rate in the logged forests is about the same, possibly even slightly higher than the old growth forest. And then in the oil palm, it's a very different system, with lots of fruit production by the oil palm that's replacing the logged forest in some areas. But I'll focus mainly on the logged forest, the old growth comparison here. So the question I'm asking is how much of this forest productivity is ending up going through key vertebrates, such as birds and mammals? And why is this interesting? Apart from just being a nice quantification exercise in itself, I would argue that the energy flow through particular gills can be a proxy for those key ecosystem services that a gill is providing, whether it's seed dispersal or nutrient cycling or predation pressure. The amount of energy flowing through seed dispersers is a measure of seed dispersal occurring. The amount of energy flowing through key nutrient cycling species or key predators is a measure of the strength of those ecosystem services. So it provides a quantification, that a currency that can work across different ecosystem services and different taxa in a way that some of the other biodiversity focused metrics can struggle. And we benefit from having a huge data set. This is a project led by Imperial with partners in Malaysia called SAFE that's studied this particular landscape for the last 10 or so years in a whole range of projects. I'm going to focus on work that my colleagues at the University of Canterbury in Kent have particularly focused on, Matt Strubig and his team, and where they've collected incredibly detailed mammal data from camera traps, and from small mammal traps, from harp traps for bats, and also lots of bird data from point counts across this landscape. And so what we've got there is a uniquely rich data set that enables us to say the abundance of every species of bird and every species of mammal pretty much in these forest types. So that enables us to explore some of these questions. So onto what we find when we do this. So this figure shows the amount of energy flowing through birds on the left and through mammals on the right in these different ecosystems. So furthest left is the old growth forest, the middle is the logged forest, and the right is the oil palm plantation. And the same goes for the mammals on the right. And so here comes surprise number one, that rather than having a reduction of energy flow, say through birds or mammals in the logged forest, we're not only seeing the energy flow is maintained, but it is amplified. It's about 2.5 times greater in the logged forest than it is in the old growth forest. And we see the same story happening in mammals. And then once you get to the oil palm plantation furthest right, you see a collapse of energy flow. So it goes up hugely in the logged system and then collapses in the old growth forest. And this is another way of looking at that. And here we look at the different guilds of within the forest, and the size of the circle here says what is the amount, indicates the amount of energy flowing through that particular guild. The orange pink color is birds, the bluish color is mammals. In the S is the number of species involved, and E is something that is we call it the energetic Shannon-Weaver index. And you can just think of it as a measure of how many species are contributing to that energy flow. So if the number is quite low, it means that one species, some generalist, has taken over, and okay, there's lots of energy flow going through, but it's simply one species doing really well there. So ecologically, the system is losing the diversity of energy flow, possibly losing its resilience. If the number is high, it's saying the energy is flowing through lots of different species. So there's a lot of diversity and resilience in the system. And what we see, if you look at these E numbers, this index, it stays high in the logged forest compared to the old growth forest. It's almost the same. There's almost no significant shift overall in that. So not only is the energy flow amplified, but it maintains the diversity of species that are providing that energy flow. So the ecosystem services seem to be amplified rather than degraded. And they begin to reverse once you get into the oil palm on the right. This is just a zoom in showing some of those numbers in more detail. And one thing that was particularly noticeable here is that there are some gills that really take off, and the one that really takes off most of all is the arboreal insectivores. So the birds that are in the trees that are gleaning invertebrates off the leaves are dominating in terms of overall energy flow in the birds, at least. For the mammals, it tends to be omnivores, wild pigs, for example, or large herbivores like deer that seem to be part of that big amplification. But insectivores are really a major part of this. So let's explore that further. What are those insectivores eating? And we can make the baseline assumption could be that they're eating invertebrates that are all directly plant feeders, like aphids, things that directly eat the plants, and therefore the trophic level of those the food that's being eaten is 2. So it's all herbivores, and using that 10% rule that I described earlier, we can argue then what fraction of the energy is required to feed the herbivorous insects that end up feeding and supporting the birds. And that tells us ultimately how much energy is needed to support the birds. And the answer we come up with is around 8% in the old growth forest, rising up to 16% of the productivity in the logged forest, then dropping down again in the oil palm. However, what birds actually eat is not only in herbivores such as aphids. They often eat spiders that are predators. They often eat other insects that are also predating on that. So the trophic level is not as low as 2. It tends to be something more mixed, something like 2.5. And studies from Borneo and from Papua New Guinea, when they look at the guts of what birds are eating, they see lots of predators such as spiders there. So the trophic level is higher, and that means that you need energy to support the spiders that end up eating the insects that require energy and that end up eating the plants. So there's a much wider pyramid of energy going up to feed the birds. And once we do those calculations with a higher trophic level, we end up calculating that about a quarter of the energy ultimately ends up being required to support the bird population. And once you go into a logged forest, it's around half of the productivity, the energy in a forest. These are much larger numbers than we initially expected. And so which mammals are dominating in this story? So when we look at the mammals, we see that it tends to be things like deer, like pigs, some rodents as well. Once we get into the logged forest, particularly deer and elephants are a major component. And then once we get into the oil palm, things fall back again. When we look at birds, we see a similar pattern of some generalists doing quite well. One thing to notice is compared to the mammals, where you've got a very sharp decline and a few species dominating in terms of energy flow, once we go to birds, the energy flow is spread out a lot across a lot more species overall. So it isn't dominated by a few species. And in that case, it's probably more resilient, that if any 1 or 2 species do poorly, the energy flow won't be affected that much, particularly in the case of birds. And which species change between the logged forest and the old growth forest? So this figure shows which species have increased in terms of their energetics as reds, and which species have decreased. And the darker colors are mammals, the lighter colors are birds. And so you see things like deer and elephant have particularly do well in this logged forest landscape, and many of the generalist bird species are doing well, and very few things are losing out. Perhaps a mouse deer and a spiny rat, but we're not seeing a huge decline in, say, rainforest specialist species disappearing from the system overall. They're still there, and very few species lose out. And so why is it that we're finding that these apparently degraded forests are actually ecologically showing amplified energetics? And there could be a matter of bottom-up factors, that these degraded forests are simply more tasty. The plant community shifts to early successional species that don't have the chemical defenses against herbivory because they prioritizing rapid growth to capture light, to outcompete their neighbors. So they're investing in fast growth and not in chemical defenses in their leaves. So the leaves are much more palatable. Also, they're more accessible to many species. These leaves are down near the ground where large herbivores, such as pigs or deer or elephants, can access them rather than being lost high up in the canopy where only a few leaf-eating species can access them. There may also be top-down factors that this dense vegetation near the ground provides protection against predators, and so some species can do better in that case. But having looked at this, we think overall predators haven't declined that much, and really it is these bottom-up factors, the fact that these degraded forests end up being more tasty and more accessible in the larder that they provide, that cause this surge in animal consumption, the surge in insects that ends up also supporting the invertebrate birds and others. So, just finally, so how does this Bornean forest compare to a British woodland? This is what I'm trying to show here is just simply how using this energetic approach opens up questions that we don't have answers to yet. So one I just showed you there about why the energetics of disturbed forests is so amplified. Another one here is how do UK woodlands compare to tropical forests? What fraction of the captured sunshine in a tropical forest ends up in mammals? It's around 1%. What fraction ends up in a British woodland? It's more like 9%. And part of that is explained by lots of deer in our woodlands because there isn't a predator knocking out those deer. But even if you take out most of this large green block, which is mainly deer, we still end up having more energy flowing through mammals in a British woodland than in a Bornean rainforest. But when we look at birds, we see the opposite pattern. Much more energy is flowing through birds in a tropical rainforest than in a British woodland. And we don't really have an answer to these questions yet. But what it does show is how thinking about energy flow and the cascade of energy in ecosystems opens up new insights, a new lens, and a way of thinking about ecosystems. This just summarizes some of these numbers that I've described. So in terms of the total consumption of energy in a Bornean forest, an old growth forest, around 1.6% of that energy, or about 0.7% of the photosynthesis, ends up in birds and mammals alone. Directly can be consumed, a lot more indirectly. Whereas in a UK woodland is around 3%, so much more of photosynthesis ends up in the birds and mammals. And so to conclude, I hope I've shown you that life on Earth is driven by this cascade of energy down from photosynthesis through all the components of an ecosystem. And thinking through ecosystems as this flow of energy can lead to some challenging and surprising results, and also new insights and questions into how the living world works. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Yadvinder. That was absolutely fascinating. And I love the fact that there are questions that we don't know the answers to. I always think that's very, very exciting. So we've got a few questions and I'll feed them to you. Somebody's asked, are you able to bound the error and discrepancy between those individual measurements and then the extrapolation out to the kind of broader macroscopic scale? What's the degree of error there?
So I am presuming this is going from the individual sites.
In Peru, yeah, back in the beginning of the talk when you were talking about the work in Peru.
Okay, yes, yeah, so the spatial variation. We're able to, at any one site, we were able to estimate the errors quite well. And it's a mixture of sampling errors, simply the variation from the samples. But the more tricky errors, the ones that really get to you, are the systematic errors, where there's a bias in your measurement or something that is harder to account for. We try and account for those. So we have a pretty good idea of the uncertainty in any one site. And then it simply becomes a matter of having enough sites that you can start understanding underlying relationships. So you can do something like a regression against climatic variables, soil variables, and each of those you can calculate the error and the uncertainty in the models that you're fitting there, and then be able to scale out to a wider scale. So yeah, the answer, I think there are quite rigorous ways of approaching the uncertainty and then scaling up the uncertainty. The most rigorous one is the uncertainty in the things you don't know, and making sure you allow for that rather than just the uncertainty that you can quantify.
So is there an advantage to, say, having many sites? Does more sites help with the
certainly
uncertainty?
Yeah, I think with our tropical forest work, one of the things that we really emphasize that there isn't any single type of tropical forest. When we first started doing these measurements, it was in the Brazilian Amazon, and where there was a lot of focus in the 90s, a lot of money put into research there, and we got some nice data there. And more recently, we've started working in Africa and Southeast Asia, as I've shown. And when we compare our data with the satellite data, what we find is that they really work well in the Brazilian Amazon. And whereas in Africa, they underestimate what's going on. In Asia, they underestimate. And part of this, I think, is not any deliberate conspiracy, but these models were developed in the 1990s with the only data that were available then, which were these Eastern Amazonian forests on very poor soils, highly weathered soils, very ancient soils of the Eastern Amazon. And that's where we developed our understanding that ended up calibrating the satellites. And if we presume that all tropical forests were like the Eastern Amazon, we end up having a flawed understanding of the functioning of the world's tropical forests.
So is there a retraining of these models then with these new data?
Essentially, that's what we're working on now with colleagues, where especially encouraging people to push out of the neotropics and understand that the breadth of variety of ecosystems across the world that all fall in this label tropical rainforest, but actually capture a whole range of climates and ecology and biogeography and lots of fascinating features.
So somebody's mentioned the talk that that Merlin Sheldrake gave at our Christmas lecture, which is a fascinating talk about fungi, and wondered, because you said at the very beginning that basically this is all about plants and fungi, you know. So is there any scope for kind of thinking about how to do that kind of measurement more?
Oh yeah, certainly. I think Berlin would approve of my first level approximation. That essentially it's plants and fungi.
I think you would too.
Everything. Yes, certainly. And this is one of the areas that also largely unknown. And one of the features of working in all these different tropical forests is that there's such an element of simple exploration and discovery, of going somewhere and describing what's there, and then fitting it into the big picture of what's found elsewhere. And this, as you know, this is certainly true in taxonomy all the time. But I would argue that it's also true in the taxonomy of ecosystems and describing what's there overall. And so one recent part of this work is with my colleague here, Jesus Aguirre Gutierrez. We're now collecting soil biological samples for all our sites across the tropics, where we've got this detailed description, and then looking at the fungal communities there. And I'm sure we'll see interesting patterns once we do it, but a lot of this is simply discovery as well. What are the fungal communities? How do they vary with elevation, with temperature, with soil type, with biogeography overall? So it certainly is a key part of what we're trying to discover.
And then all those other microbes as well.
Yes, yeah.
Somebody else has asked about farmland in the Amazon. So, and I think, and I don't know if you've done any work on some of that really kind of pasture land, farmland, really truly very, very altered habitats in the Amazon. So what happens with the energy used for fertilizer production if you calculate the energy that's used for fertilizer production in habitats like that?
Okay, that's a very different question. So I think that's the embodied energy in the social industrial system that produces the fertilizers that then end up going in there. That's certainly a huge amount. So I'm not sure exactly what the question's getting at there.
I'm not sure either, but
you can compare the amount of energy being produced in situ by the ecosystem with the amount of energy being added to the system in farming. And I think certainly that would be quite a substantial portion of that, but that also does increase the amount of energy being captured by the system, because if the productivity is higher,
Yeah.
on the soybean field, etc., you'd get high productivity.
Now, someone else has asked an interesting question about that in the last part of the talk, you talked about the old growth and the kind of secondary forests in Borneo, and you were seemingly treating them, which I know you know they're not, is as steady state systems. So is there anything to be learned by the dynamic effects either over time or spatial interfaces between these two different types of forests?
Between the old growth and the
yeah, sort of because of course logged forest turns into kind of old growth forest as it gets older, of course.
Yeah, so certainly I think that is an open question because we need more data, but certainly you'd expect these energetics to shift over time as the system goes back. And one thing I want to say, maybe I didn't emphasize this enough in my talk, but I know I'll have to bore it off this. Old growth forests are fantastic, and there's lots of reasons to protect and preserve them. So, the fact that we're seeing the surprising energetics in logged forests doesn't at all diminish how important.
Oh no, of course not. No. They have other things going for them.
But what I suspect is if we did a sequence of an old growth forest, then logging it and recovering it, we'd see the ecological energetics actually rising up following logging, maybe a few years after logging or disturbance, and then slowly declining back down to old growth levels over 40, 50 years, that sort of time scale. But we haven't got the data to prove that. That's just a speculation at the moment overall. And it's interesting to think why this is going on. And in some ways, but old growth forests tend to be a climax ecosystem where everything's grabbed light as much as it has got, and trees tend to be very conservative, very slow growing, holding on to what they're going. And when you disturb a system, whether through a windstorm or a large herbivore, or in logging, in selective logging in this case, you're shaking up that system and changing making a lot more light available and a lot more energy available. And that disrupts the entire flow. And that isn't necessarily, in every ecological sense, a bad thing. In some ways, that can actually be unfreezing a system that's slightly locked up into this steady state mature system.
Yeah, because I mean, second growth forests are fantastically interesting. There's lots of really interesting things that go on in them. They were talking about, so here's another question about, thanks, everybody's saying thanks for this amazing presentation, by the way, so just bear that in mind. Pertaining to logged versus old growth, even though logged forests sustain animal species, is it correct to infer a larger loss of biomass and energy because of the plant loss from the old as compared to the old growth?
So overall, biomass overall has certainly declined because plants dominate in terms of the overall biomass of the ecosystem. Animals are almost trivial in terms of actual biomass. But in terms of stored energy, plants have a lot stored in their biomass, in their wood, in their leaves. But a lot of that is frozen energy in some senses. If you're locked into the wood of a tree,
not flowing, is it?
The energy is there for hundreds of years. The flow of energy is the component that is really ramped up in the disturbed system compared to the old growth system. So you're unfreezing energy essentially, and it's cascading through the system and producing all of these unexpected effects.
It's a fascinating, absolutely fascinating result. Someone else has asked, is there any equivalent work to this, any work like this in other types of ecosystems such as grasslands or peatlands or other types of systems?
In terms of the productivity, the first part of my talk, yes, there's a fair bit going on in lots of different ecosystems. I focused particularly on the tropics because until 15 years ago, they were relatively neglected, and compared to all the people studying forests outside of their laboratories in Europe and North America. There's plenty of that. In terms of the energetics, yes, in some cases, but relatively few places where you have that comprehensive data of all the species. So even local, just to take White and Woods, our local example, as an example, there's lots of wonderful work here on particular species of birds and their behavior, particular species of mammal and their behavior. but there'd been very little systematic synthesis across all species to say this is how many of these species there are. And so actually this abundance-focused work is relatively rare, but there are notable exceptions. There's wonderful work done in the savannas of Africa where all the herbivores and animals have been quantified, and there's an understanding there. So it's been done, but there's still relatively few points given the size of the biosphere.
Yeah, I think that's, and it's also the comparative nature of what you're doing is so fascinating, looking at these different tropical rainforests, which is, it's fascinating because the plant diversity is so high in the Amazon compared to Africa or Asia, but yet the soils are different, and all that factors into it. Someone has asked a question that involves kind of deep time evolution of birds and mammals. So what she's asking, I think, is that the fact that birds are essentially dinosaurs. Dinosaurs have been around for a lot longer than mammals have, and have been in tropical forests, of course, therefore, for longer than mammals have. Does that have something to do with this relative uptake of energy?
That's an interesting question. I have no idea what the answer to that is. I remember seeing a fascinating talk, and there was a nice paper last year by a Colombian group. I think it was in Science or Nature, where they described the forest of the Amazon just before and after the asteroid impact, the dinosaur killing asteroid impact. Mm-hmm. And just before the impact, it seemed to be where it was a gymnosperm Araucaria dominated, almost like a large savanna, where the giant dinosaurs are opening up this system and creating not really a savanna, but not a closed canopy forest system. And it seemed to be the asteroid that wiped out the large dinosaurs that enabled the angiosperms, the broadleaf forest, as a closed canopy forest to appear for the first time after that. So what we think of now as the modern tropical rainforest is a creation, but this paper would argue it was a creation of the asteroid impact and knocking out the dinosaurs. And I'm sure that's still open to debate, and we need more data from more sites before we can be sure of that. So, but in some ways, if that is the truth, then birds as the surviving dinosaurs and then mammals are actually similar in age in terms of when they started dominating modern tropical rainforests. So in that sense, they've had as long, obviously the different types of mammals and different things, and they've had it equally long in terms of their interaction with this creation of this new environment, the closed leaf tropical broadleaf rainforest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of debate about when rainforests were and where they were and what they were like, because of course the tropical rainforests of the Eocene were in a very different place to the tropical rainforests of today, which is something I find absolutely fascinating. Someone has asked about detritivores. Has there anyone been working on the quantification of the energy that flows through the detritivore community? You kind of touched on that with fungi, but there's a whole bunch of other detritivores as well.
Yes, I'm not an expert on that, but certainly there are lots of soil ecologists and biologists that try and work on that and describe that in detail. From my limited attempt to try and do this at our local woods in Whiten, I realized it's a huge black box that literally as soon as you get to the soil, the detailed quantification of the different faunal compositions, but also then understanding what's eating what, because everything's just cycling around and things are eating themselves and their own species and things. So the whole food web idea really gets quite messy and entangled once you get into the soil system overall. But ultimately, 90% of the energy that's captured ends up in that soil system. And so it's hugely important to understand, but you end up having very crude ideas, and broadly, this is what fungi are doing, this is what invertebrates are doing, but the details of it are really
all that going on underneath our feet, and it just looks like it's just sitting there. Isn't it amazing? Someone has also asked, kind of thinking about the differences between African and other tropical forests, which you touched on a bit about the soils, and we all experienced the kind of blood rain yesterday, at least in London. We got the sand from the Sahara yesterday. Can the differences between African and other tropical forests in part be ascribed to the still extant megafauna in Africa?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And one, there could be a few. There are a few interesting biogeographic differences between Africa and say South America. The extant megafauna in some places in Africa, very few now, is part of that. The termite is another one, that Africa has much higher biomass of soil-feeding termites, order of magnitude higher than the neotropics. Termites originated in Africa, and some of them rafted across to the Americas, but only a subset of the clades that are found in Africa. So biogeography ends up mattering a lot there. I would say on the megafauna side, we're exploring this, probably not, at least in the short time scale of decades, because many of the sites that we're studying in West Africa essentially have lost their megafauna already. So they're not megafauna-rich systems.
Yeah.
We're seeing this biggest effect. And actually in Gabon, in the Congo Basin, where there are lots of megafauna and we have some of these plots, we don't see much higher productivity there. But that Gabon is not in the downwind footprint of the Sahara in terms of dust deposition. So that would argue, for example, it's something to do with the inputs rather than the megafauna.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. There's someone's asking you to show us some more data, Yadvinder. I think you've showed us quite a lot. Is there data on is there any data on total energy in old growth logged forests and oil palms rather than energy flows? So I guess the question is about, why measure energy flows? Is total energy a better measure?
Yeah, well, total energy is actually quite straightforward to calculate if you choose to. Well, I don't think we've done those numbers, but if you know the biomass of leaves, of wood, you can assign an energy content to that by each of those types of organ and then calculate it. So we could do that calculation without too much difficulty. I would argue that frozen energy is not that interesting. I think it's the energy, the flow of energy. The physicist in me says work is the flow of energy, and ecological work is what drives an ecosystem. So so it's much more interesting what's moving around and cascading through the ecosystem than what's locked in a piece of wood not doing anything.
Yeah, and in a way what's flowing is what's driving evolution.
Yes. Yeah.
In general, I would say that's really interesting. I'm going to ask you one question of my own before we finish. Is I've always been interested in that zone that's between, like in a tree fall or a blowdown, the zone that's between the secondary forest that's coming up and the forest that's old growth that's still there.
Right. Yes.
Do you think there's anything, because it always seems to me that there's special things going on there, that it's not the same as the second growth, and it's also not the same as the other. Would there be any value in looking at that almost that ecotone, although it can be quite narrow?
Yes, and almost certainly. It'd be an interesting thing. I guess part of that ecotone is that you haven't lost the species composition of the old growth forest. You just change the environment, so the trees are still there, but suddenly they're flooded in light from the gap and doing different things. Or once you get into the actual secondary forest, often there's the succession going on there, and you've got totally different species that are adapted to that. So I'd expect something that's in between in terms of function and different specialisms to that particular environment of being structurally quite intact, but being flooded by light resources in a way that the old growth forest isn't.
Yeah, it's just that they've always been really interesting. Well, they're always really interesting places to me because cool things grow there.
Yeah.
So that's really fun. Oh, Yadvinder, thank you so much for an absolutely fascinating talk. And it's really made me think about all those forests in a really different way. So thanks so much for coming along and giving the talk and interacting with everybody. And hopefully we can see you again, as my kids say, in true life. One day soon.
I hope so.
That would be great.
And thank you. It's been a fascinating conversation, and thank you everyone for all your.
Thanks so much.
See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.